Okay, I see we're all excited to be here today. Good morning. My name is Kelly Ravenia. I'm the University Archivist at Utah State University. See if I can get this to work. So this presentation will be talking about a term I essentially made up, secondary processing and university archives. So to begin, I'll introduce our presenters. Heather Housley is the University Archive Special Projects Technician. Did I get that right? Becky Skeen is the Special Collections Cataloging Librarian, and Paul Daybell is our Archival Cataloging Librarian. So just to kind of give you an overview, the secondary processing is part of a larger project. You'll hear a lot about it during this conference. I'm sure you're all very excited. So I'm just going to kind of give a brief overview of that project. My colleagues will talk about the original scope, and then I'll talk about how I messed up that timeline. And we'll have examples. So kind of give you the context. Prior to 2018, most of Utah State University's material was not online. About 2% actually had a electronic finding aid. Most of them were physical, so either in the collection itself or in card catalogs. Most description was accessed through the University Archivist, and that's not me. Yeah, you actually can meet former University Archivist Bob Parson. If you go to the reception tonight, his band will be playing. People still look at me and say, "You're not Bob," and they are correct. Bob and I do not look similar, and sometimes I think people think I'm not the University Archivist, but that's their problem. So the original goals of this project was to create an entire inventory for the University Archives. Well, that was typed up and accessible. And then allow for easier tracking of materials, create those finding aids, and then put them online. And then also put those finding aid records in our library catalog Sierra. Okay, sorry, looking at two different places. So the original kind of workflow of this project was 4 phases. My colleagues will speak to these more in depth in just a moment. But the first step was to inventory the collection. It was a lot of work, and I'm a little thankful I was not here to have to endure that. I joined USU in July of 2021. All the people who worked on that project, the cataloging department, students, did a phenomenal job. We have a giant spreadsheet that saves my life a lot trying to find stuff. Phase 2 was quality control. Remember this phase, it's going to come up. So that was just making sure a lot of the kind of metadata, collection titles, etc., were correct, and then DAX compliant. Phase 3 was actually making those EAD creation finding aids, and then ingesting it into archive space, which is what we use for the back end. We use Archives West as our public-facing database. And then phase 4 was to actually ingest those EAD records into MARC so that we could upload them to the library catalog. So I joined, as I said, in July 2021. Heather joined in October 2021. And so kind of as we got this project rolling, we were finishing up QC for, I won't say 30% of the collection. I just made that number up. But it was kind of during this early kind of finishing the QA phase that I kind of noticed certain things. There's some description discrepancies, physical conditions, etc. And so we kind of started to think, like, should we address this? And so here's some examples. And I know some of you are thinking, Kelly, that's not that bad. My archives are on fire in a volcano at the bottom of the ocean. But I kind of wanted to point out, so like kind of the perspective for deciding to kind of begin some of this secondary processing. So the description was helpful to the prior university archivist. He knew this collection very well. Unfortunately, I do not have his knowledge of the archives. In the upper left there, he had some interesting description. Actually, I don't know who did that, but I'll just let you imagine what that said. It also says Dairy Chase. It should say Daryl Chase, one of USU's presidents, and the 1 is upside down. So there was some issues with the existing description on boxes and for collections. That was not really helpful if you're going to ingest that into finding aids, because I don't think that's the most helpful description to users or to me, but maybe it is. The second is we found some preservation issues. I'm sure all of you have dealt with this. When essentially slumping in boxes, this is not that too bad of an example, but it was pretty persistent across the collection. And this kind of just happens over time, and then it multiplies by gazillion boxes. And then you're like, well, I'll get to it eventually. And the last one is USU University Archives is a little unique in how we number and structure the collections. We have a call number system that's based off the federal government's one. And so this collection, these numbers made sense when it was a card catalog. Unfortunately, when you try to upload collection numbers into Archives West, they can only have one. So we ended up having collections that were split. Sometimes, I don't know if you can see that very well, but sometimes one collection would be split in between 1 and 20 different collections. Sometimes those collections would have multiple series that were the same. So, reports, because that's just how it was kind of generated organically in the paper one. If people didn't know there was a series for reports, they'd make another one or a miscellaneous one. So these were some issues that we were facing. And now my colleagues will kind of talk about the original scope of the project, and then we'll get to the processing.
All right, as you can see from the previous slides, we had 4 phases to our archival process. Phase 1, which was creating a complete inventory of everything in the university archives. In this phase, we had 4 basic steps that laid the groundwork for collecting the material information that we would then map into our archive space and CR databases. These basic steps were pulling all items of the shelf off the shelves to be physically checked, recording the record group, series title, and descriptions for each box or item, barcoding each box or item and entering them into the Airtable database and Sierra if they were already cataloged, and then returning the boxes to, or items to the stacks or the shelves. Our full procedures are in that link up there if anybody's really interested in all that. Because at the same time, we were working on a barcoding project for barcoding everything in special collections. So barcoding was a major part of these activities. Phase 2 was the quality control, as Kelly mentioned. After physically going through the archives collection completely and finishing the initial inventory, it was decided that it would be beneficial to go through the materials a second time for quality control. The main reason behind this was because it was a complex process that took some time for everybody to fully understand and implement consistently. We were having some problems early on because it was just so complex. So we decided we should go back and double check basically. So by performing a quality control check of the data in Airtable, we would be able to provide the most complete and correct data for each item or collection. Here we have listed on this slide the main elements of the person doing the quality control we're verifying. We want to check to make sure it had a barcode, because again, that was one of our major projects we were working on. It included the date range, basic description, any access restrictions, if there was a record in Sierra already, the location of the material, the container type and dimensions, if there were a subseries sharing the same boxes. We have a lot of those where we have several subseries in the same box. And that was just a way that we could notate that and collect them later for when we loaded them into archive space. And then any useful notes that people might find useful. So.
Okay, so after we did the initial inventory, we wanted to go in and export those inventories and create the finding aids. So with over 2,600 University Archives collections without online finding aids, there was a lot of work to do that needed to be done. Our EAD specialist, Sarah, worked to streamline this process by using a fleshed out XML template for the University Archives, where she could easily kind of plug and play the front matter for the collections. Because these finding aids were built off a shelf list, the finding aid front matter is fairly flat compared to like a fully processed collection. Although the EAD specialist did make all necessary updates in concert with the university archivist to make these collections DAX compliant. The EAD specialist then uses the shelf inventory in Airtable to export a CVS file of the collection inventories before using a mail merge process in Word to create the XML coded inventory. And then once the XML file is complete, the EAD guide is uploaded to both the Archives Space and Archives West systems respectively. So since starting this project in 2019, we've seen a huge progress in the number of collections now discoverable online. So before this project started, we only had a total of 53 university archives collections that were available online, which made up only about 2% of the entire collection. So over the last 4 years, we now have about 1,400 of these collections available online, which is up about 2,600%. With the steady stream of new collections coming in online each month, to date, we're about 52% of the way through this process for the online finding aids created. And phase 4, we have our MARC creation and cataloging. So this is still a work in progress. We're working out the kinks of doing that. But once we get time and staffing and a harder resolve, we'll start working on that project as well. So, but there's a lot of work to be done.
So we found several common themes in the materials as we were going through them for this project, and we're not sure if the processors didn't have access to 0.25 letterboxes or if spacers were less acceptable or available, but we found a lot of half-empty boxes and materials that over the years had relaxed into a slump. And items that have relaxed into a slump for 50 years tend to like to remain that way. And so we had to be careful about reflattening and providing the support. We went through a lot of spacers. It's the rubber cement. We came across a lot of rubber cement. And while it's too late to undo some of that damage, we were at least able to interfile some acid-free paper in between to prevent the deterioration from continuing. One fascinating example I really love is this photograph. You can see how the emulsion has seemed to seep into the facing paper, providing almost a photocopy, copied itself. The loose photographs that we came across were put into sleeves, but most of the photographs were attached in reports, and so we just sandwiched them with acid-free paper. We also came across a lot of rust and even some mold. I removed piles of paper clips and prong fasteners, and for the sake of time and to keep this project from lasting into eternity, I left the staples alone unless they were already rusted or were causing damage to the surrounding papers. Mold is not typically a problem that we have in the Intermountain West in our dry climate, but I did find about 20 agricultural ledgers that had evidence of active mold. And so I got to freeze and then later disassemble them under a vent hood and vacuum and rehouse in boxes. And I'd only worked in archives for a few months at that point, so it was tremendously exciting an adventure for me. As far as non-physical secondary processing goes, the main issue we found, aside from there not being any records at all, were the brief MARC records that contained very little information, like this one that says it's policies and procedures of what organization, we're not sure, what time frame, who wrote it. We weren't sure that this was very helpful at all, these kinds of records. So in everything that we did, we had to balance the time we spent reprocessing the materials with the enormity of what still needed to be done. It was an attempt to avoid the folly of dilly-dally while still following MPLP processing guidelines. We compromised a little and consider our efforts more product, little more process. Any questions? Oh, back. Oh, yeah, back. Go for it.
Apologies. Let me see if I can find. Woo. Okay, so looks like a few slides are missing, so I'm going to have to ask you to use your imagination here in a moment. As kind of those examples went through, secondary processing, in my opinion, it's not really reprocessing. Reprocessing essentially involves a lot, it's similar, but kind of a different thing. It's usually when you go back to a specific collection or collections, doing a lot of work. This is kind of a mishmash of doing preservation work. We're not really reprocessing the collections. We do restructure some, but that's essentially amalgamating collections that were split apart just for reasons when they were physical copies. And then we do some of the titles we find are not either DAX compliant or are probably not helpful to both internal and external stakeholders. So kind of the benefits of this One, it does help with actually knowing what's in the collections. If we're going to be doing this work, if you can imagine pulling, I think 21,000 boxes off the shelves, opening them up, looking at them, it's like we might as well do it while we're here. It does add a lot of work to an already large project. I think we've put in about 1,400 hours. I can't say all of those were dedicated exactly to secondary processing, but it is a lot of work. But we are essentially, we have the boxes, we're doing the work. In my opinion, we might as well do it now. Some of the drawbacks, again, it takes a lot of time and resources. And when you're already dealing with a large collection, it can be kind of hard to justify all this work when 98% of your collection didn't have finding aids. It's like, well, we'll just use the description as is. But that does create its own problems. Thankfully, administration has been supportive of this work, but it is something kind of you need to think about if you want to do these large scale redescription processes, because it takes so much time. It also can be disruptive to patrons. We've kind of lucked out. This is done mostly by record group. So I think only in a few instances that we've had to delay patron requests, but like by a week or two. But if you're going to be doing this kind of work and like on a large scale, it can be disruptive. Okay, skip forward. Any questions?
So we do have just over 20 minutes for questions. If you have questions for anybody from the group, I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A. So if you're online, please type in the Q&A and I will read your question out. If you are in the room and you are asking or answering a question, please use a microphone. I have some to pass around. You could also come up and speak into this microphone. People online can see you if you are standing here, but not if you're anywhere else. So does anybody have any questions?
Okay, I'll go. My question is for Lisa. Yes, so I saw you had up a temporary permission form up there. What were some of the options on that temporary permission form and what purpose did it serve?
So we included restrictions that people could place on their oral history as they were filling out the form or donating it to us. I can't remember all of the options, but there was different time lengths. So if they wanted it restricted for a certain length of time, I think they had restrictions. Restrictions about who could access it or where it could be accessed or what they could do with it. So we tried to give people, we don't want people to put restrictions on everything, but tried to give some people some common options so they had some control over their oral histories and how it could be used.
My question's also for the two of you. I'm curious about oral histories, those that you did that were accessible and discoverable. Was there any sort of work done to make them ADA compliant? I don't know if you put them up to be globally accessible, if they have transcripts, closed captioning.
Yeah. So what's really great about Aviary, and I promise you, Aviary is not giving me any money to talk about how wonderful they are, but I think it's a really wonderful product. They do allow the generation and uploading of transcripts, which are keyword searchable and they're time coded. The way we do that is we use a software program called otter.ai, and we just upload raw transcripts because it's very time consuming to go in and do really detailed editing of those. And what's great about that is you can set those transcripts as closed captioning, which is displays while the oral history is playing. Another thing that's really great about it is those oral histories that we restrict to in-house use, content that's still that's included in the transcript can still be discoverable through a keyword search, either at the portal or on the individual item. And so it will return, say somebody's looking for like the keyword Tucson or something, and it will show up on this restricted oral history. You just can't access it, but you can see like this information might be contained within this oral history, and that way you can request it and come listen to it or view it. Yeah. that answer your question?
I have one from online, which is also for your project, Arizona. What was your process for finding the next of kin for oral history permission forms?
Yeah, that's been really tricky, as you can imagine, because you have to go through some sort of perceived vetting process that this person says who they are, right? And we don't have a foolproof manner or mechanism for that at all. The way most people have, the way we've done this, and it's only been a handful, is that people will discover the oral histories that we have put up online that are restricted, and they'll say, hey, this is my grandmother. We actually just had a guy this week say, this is my grandmother. Can I listen to this? And I'm a little bit more, if it's a relative, I'll be a little more, forgiving and say, okay, here, but are you interested in signing this release form? And it's always been the case where I've never not have a person request an oral history that they say they're related to and not have them sign a release form. So it's been very much them approaching us. We're taking more of a passive approach to it. There are some projects in the future, some oral histories that we digitize that we perceive as having real potential research potential. So we're probably going to start thinking about how we can proactively reach out to next of kin. And I know Lisa has some experience doing that in South Dakota, but it's not an easy process, and we don't have the resources to dedicate to that right now. In the future, maybe.
Thank you. Other questions?
Thank you. My question is for Kelly. And I was curious if you had experience doing that sort of archival work of moving kind of getting a collection more accessible, or how you went about figuring it out.
I guess the answer is it depends. Well, that doesn't really make sense, but like sort of. I think a lot of archivists kind of have to deal with retro description. Either the description's outdated, it's not descriptive enough, it's too vague, it's not correct, et cetera, et cetera. So in my previous position, I was a processing archivist, so updating a lot of description either to be more accurate or just provide description that's helpful to people. Sometimes finding aids, some of mine are just like C content or C register for finding aid. So people online are like, what does that mean? Or miscellaneous. I'm sure Heather, if you talk to her, will tell you all about how I like rant to her about the word miscellaneous, which then I'm just like, oh, just use assorted, which isn't any more helpful, but it's not miscellaneous. And so when approaching this work, I think that those kind of skill transferred of like you're creating description that's both compliant to DACS and also kind of helpful both to our patrons and to us essentially. I think that's something that's get overlooked. Like, how is description a tool for archivists? How do I find things without looking through 100 boxes and dying? So that I think that approach carried over into this work.
Well, all right. Thank you so much to all of our presenters. That was great. And we can give them all a hand again and head off to lunch about 15 minutes early.